Hello from Studio 1378. Welcome to the latest episode, episode 5 in our ongoing series on U.S. history from Reconstruction to the present. I'm your narrator, host, Professor Wapazanko. In the previous episodes, we've been talking about Reconstruction, the failure to address racial issues, industrialization, class formation, protest struggles, populism, progressivism, and other things, and we'll keep going today. So thank you for being such loyal viewers. I've noticed a lot of you are subscribing to YouTube so you get notifications, which is probably the easiest way to do it, but I've been sending out emails when new lectures go up. So let's move forward to lecture 5. In our last show, we talked about imperialism and progressivism, and that's where we're going to pick up today. We were talking about progressivism, and I mentioned that there are kind of two different ways to look at that. One is the most common one, which you've probably read about or heard about in high school classes, or just in discussions or TV history shows or whatever. And that idea of progressivism was that there were still a lot of problems around it. People noticed them, they took account of them. You had journalists and others who were called muckrakers who were pointing those out. Lincoln Steffens talking about corruption, and Ida Tarbell talking about Rockefeller's corruption, and the most famous, the most notable was Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, letting everybody know that the hamburger they were eating was pretty rancid, it was pretty bad. So that people protested, they wrote letters, they demanded something be done. And as a consequence of that, the government passed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So progressivism is seen as calling attention to a problem like bad meat, child labor, sweatshops, all kinds of stuff like that, unequal rights for women, and just a bunch of different stuff. And so the idea there is you call attention to these, politicians listen to you, and then they do something about it, which is the way democracy is supposed to work. So that's the typical traditional narrative, the typical traditional story of progressivism or progressives. I remember, as I said the other day, basically everybody was calling him or herself a progressive back then. So you had people like Eugene Debs, who was a socialist, who was called a progressive, and you had Andrew Carnegie, who was like the richest guy in the world, calling himself a progressive because Carnegie believed that people should be educated, there should be libraries and schools and things like that. So it's a really big and broad term. It's not anti-capitalist. It's not all like the populist who wanted the government to take over railroads and banks and stuff currency and stuff like that. There's not that's not happening here. People like Debs are socialists, but they're going way beyond what a typical progressive would. So the term is not really as appropriate for somebody like Debs as it would be for a lot of these other people who were talking about sweatshops or child labor or things like that. And Upton Sinclair was actually a socialist as well. And remember, he went to Chicago not to write about how disgusting the meat was and how dangerous it was. He went there to write about the workers and how bad, work conditions were. And then when he got there, he saw, rats and stuff scurrying around the meat. So that's what changed the focus of his book, right? So that's kind of the main way that people look at progressives and progressivism. But then I pointed out that there's another way of looking at it too, that some people saw progressivism as an example, and I think this is important as we go forward, of reform, but not reform because the people protested and forced the politicians to do something, but reform actually because the people at the top of the economy, the people who had power, who had money, who controlled corporations, who controlled banks, who controlled big companies and had had access to politics, who had, made donations to politicians and endorsed politicians and had good relations with, senators and congressmen and cabinet members and things like that, wanted reform. So, and the traditional way of looking at reform is kind of progressivism. It's reform from the bottom up. The people, the bottom of that social pyramid, demand that something be done, and then the government responds to it, right? And there's all kinds of examples of that, in terms of safety and bad products. In the 1960s, there was a massive controversy over DDT, which was a pesticide that was killing birds and all kinds of animals used, commonly in agriculture, and so it was banned, right? So that's one element of reform from the bottom, the people. the masses of people demand that something be done in Congress, or whoever listens and they fix it, right? Now, this other one that I briefly mentioned the other day, I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, and I think it's important. I know it's not the easiest thing in the world, and it would be much easier if we were having a conversation in class about it, but it's also important because in many ways, I think it's important to understand that reform often gets done for reasons that come from the top down rather than from the bottom up. And often the motivation is to try to stop or keep competition down, right? Because, you know, the idea in this economy is all competition is good. But if you're in business, especially if you're a big business, you don't want competition. So competition is not good if you're like in business, because you don't want to have to deal with the issues that excessive competition brings about. And in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, there was intense competition. There were businesses all over the place, and not all businesses are equal. Big businesses have advantages that other businesses don't. So smaller businesses often do things that may harm the entire industry. And I'll give you examples of that so you don't have to, I'm not trying to just be theoretical here. There's real stuff going on that we'll talk about. So, and meatpacking is a big part of this, the jungle's a big part of this. But let me start with something a little different, which is banking and the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And I know that that's like not the most direct thing on your mind, but the Fed has a massive influence over your life. If you have a credit card, if you have a student loan, if you have a car note, if you have a house mortgage, the Fed plays a major role in every decision you make. If you buy lunch and use a credit card, the Fed has an impact on your life. So the Fed actually has an impact on your life pretty much every day. Outside of the private personal lives you lead, the economy is probably the most direct influence on things you do. You know, where you can go, what you can do, what kind of debt you have, whether you have credit cards, whether you can pay your student debt. You know, so all of that's really important. And the Federal Reserve is the dominant banking regulator in America. Has a great deal of influence over that. So in the early 1900s, the problem was that there were too many banks as far as the big banks, which are headquartered in Wall Street, saw it. The banking industry in the earliest days of the American Republic tended to be focused on like Philadelphia, but then it became New York and Wall Street, although all of those eastern cities were big banking cities, right? But Wall Street is just kind of synonymous. It's kind of a symbol of banking in the world, really, of America. But there aren't just Wall Street banks. There are small banks too. There are municipal banks, there are state banks, there are local banks, and those banks set themselves up. They weren't regulated very much. So one community might have several banks. I think I actually did talk a little bit about this the other day. Those banks contributed to local politicians. They weren't regulated. There wasn't much oversight. So they were often doing very dangerous banking things. They would give out loans to companies that were already weak, that may not be able to pay them back because they needed the business. So they're in competition with these other banks. So they're going to have to take risks. Yeah, sure, I know you're rickety, but we'll give you a loan. And they're in competition. Well, they said they'd give you a loan at 4%. We'll give you 3.5 points, right? So it's they're vying for people's business, which is risky. So they would offer interest rates that were low, which made it easier for shaky businesses that were on the borderline to get credit. And they couldn't get those kinds of loans. They couldn't get any kind of credit from more conservative banks like Wall Street banks. They don't want to go anywhere near you, right? I mean, that's why in America, so many people go to Title Max and payday lenders and loan sharks and pawn shops and things like that, because they can't get loans from big established regular banks who don't want to take those kinds of risks. Smaller banks in 1900 did want to take those kinds of risks. And when you take a risk like that, very well those people may not be able to pay you back if things go bad, if times get tough. And in fact, that was what was happening. A lot of banks began to fail, and those deposits were losing. People who deposited in those banks were losing their money. If the bank goes under and you deposited $1,000, you're out. There's no guarantee or insurance or anything like that. So people who had made deposits in a lot of these local banks that had gone under began to complain, and they began to protest, and they began to talk to their politicians locally and congressmen and senators and so forth, and said, you need to fix this. the government has to do something to reform this. Americans don't really like bankers. You know, in the early 1900s, I'm not sure there's ever been a point in American history where people, you know, really love people. You know, they're creditors. It's not the warmest relationship in normal times. So a lot of people didn't like the entire banking industry, not just their local banks that they believe screwed them out of their deposits, but any bank, Wall Street Bank, Philadelphia Bank, doesn't matter. You know, Citibank, Chase Bank, JP Morgan, doesn't matter. They're all bankers. To them are dangerous and risky and bad, right? So the difference here, though, is that the big banks, even though the people didn't really trust them, the big banks actually had the same view as the typical American. Both sides, the typical people, many of whom had lost money in local banks, and these big Wall Street banks, which have a lot of money, want those small banks regulated, punished, put out of business, whatever, because both of them are damaging people's interests as far as they're concerned. The people who deposited money and lost it believe their personal interests were damaged, but those Wall Street banks, who now are part of an industry which nobody trusts and nobody wants to be around, believe their interests are damaged as well. So because of this, Wall Street banks went to the government and demanded reform, which is the same thing that a bunch of small people were doing too. Now, let's be real. Wall Street bankers are going to be heard a lot more easily in Congress, by senators, by congressmen, by governors, by politicians, by cabinet members, by presidents. They're going to be heard a lot more easily by those people than small people who lost $500 are. So the big bankers, Wall Street, places like that, Chicago, Philadelphia, big bankers went to the government and said, we want laws to regulate banking, to regulate us. And that way, those smaller banks, which are doing things that are unstable, will be run out of business. And in that way, once they're gone, the banking industry will be stabilized. We've talked about that, right? How stability is really important. You know, they want to make money. They're not, you know, deeply concerned with the welfare of everybody, but they also want social stability. And if everybody's losing money, if the banks are going under, if people are running around complaining and, you know, joining the populists, which had an anti-bank ideology, you know, the populists were big on like doing something about bankers. And so bankers don't want that. They would rather stabilize the system, make it safe, centralize it, so there's somebody who's regulating all banks, not just, you know, local regulation, which can be different state to state or area to area. So these there it is. These bankers then demand that something be done. And the result of that is the Federal Reserve Act. And again, you know, like I said before, you may not know much about the Fed, but it's actually really important. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. Woodrow Wilson was the president. Wilson was on very good terms with bankers. And this is the point at which banking became probably the most important industry in the United States. I'm not going to go into this too much because it's not critical, and don't worry, you're not going to be tested on it. But there are different kinds of capitalism. There's industrial capitalism, which we've talked about a lot, right? Which is companies that actually make things, right? But there's also financial capitalism, which is banking and money, and that's a huge element. And with the Federal Reserve Act, financial capitalism became even more important. Now, the Federal Reserve is kind of controversial, was then, still is today. Banking is in a crisis. It was in a crisis in 1907. The government had to bail out banks. It had to give them $38 million. And JP Morgan, the biggest banker in America, you probably heard the name, went to Europe and he got $50 million privately held in order to help bail out the banking system. At the same time, there was a congressional committee investigating the Rockefeller Trust, which found that the Rockefeller Trust controlled over 100 corporations valued at $22 billion. So the banking industry is going under while this one particular corporation has 20 plus billion dollars. So there's this real big crisis going on, and the government says we got to do something. The government did that in 2008 and 2009. during the Great Recession not that long ago. You guys were probably very young, and it's doing that right now. It's been doing that since last fall, and clearly in the last few months, the Federal Reserve has intervened and is now the most important institution in the American economy. The Fed has created trillions of dollars for COVID relief and all kinds of other things. This was actually occurring before COVID hit last fall. The Fed was doing loans for banks, overnight loans. Again, this is kind of a side thing. It's important, but it's not, you're not going to be tested on it. Banks borrow money all the time. Many banks, pretty much every business and bank does overnight lending. In order, for instance, to make payroll, in order to be able to pay people on Fridays, banks generally take a big loan out in order to have that money available. So loans are occurring all the time. Now, sometimes that gets tight. Those short-term loans get tight, and the Fed has to come in. So last fall, before COVID even hit, the Fed was giving hundreds of billions of dollars in overnight loans to banks so that they could meet their obligations literally the next day or that week. So banking occurs 24/7. It's never not working. It's never not operating, right? So the Fed was a way to address that, and that's what's happened in 2020 as well. 2019 and 2020, the same thing's going on. The Fed is a private institution. It consists of private banks. There's no state banks in the United States. We have private banking system, right? The Federal Reserve is in Washington, D.C., and then there are 12 Federal Reserve banks all across the country. The closest one is in Dallas. There's a Dallas Fed, but there's a Houston branch of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank on Allen Parkway, really cool building. I'm sure you've gone past it. So the Federal Reserve Act was important because it controlled the money supply. It would set requirements for banks in order to stay in business, reserve requirements. They'd have to have a certain amount of money on hand. And it set interest rates. So all that's really important. Money supply and interest rates is something that actually affects you every single day. So the goal of the Fed was to make it harder, if not impossible, for these small banks to continue to do the kinds of reckless things they were doing, which was causing individuals, working individuals, to lose their life savings. So that's the idea behind the Fed. So it does help individuals in that it regulates banks, it centralizes banking, right? But the real purpose of it, and this is where this idea of corporate liberalism or this other kind of progressive comes in, is that they wanted to create a banking system that was good for Wall Street and for other banks in Chicago, Philadelphia, places like that. They set reserve requirements, the amount of money you had to have on hand, so that big banks would have no problem meeting those reserves, but smaller banks would. So, you don't have to, like if you deposit $1,000 in a bank, that $1,000 doesn't sit there, in a box. It's loaned out, it's invested in things like that. So the amount of money a bank actually has on hand is always just a small fraction of what it actually holds. So the Fed created requirements that they have a certain amount on hand, which for small banks is really a significant burden. And so a lot of them couldn't survive because of that, whereas the Wall Street banks, even though their reserve requirements, as a percentage were higher, had no problem meeting that, right? So the reserve requirements are important. The Fed regulated the money supply. That meant that it could determine how much money was actually put out there. So it could inflate currencies, it could deflate currencies. 2020 is not a good way to give an example of that because the Fed has dumped over $2, $3, $4 trillion into the economy. We're not seeing inflation, which is not the way the economy usually works. However, there's always the chance that will occur. What you generally do by making money available, which means you put money out there at very low interest rates, it usually causes inflation because everybody has access to money, right? So money isn't worth as much, which means that things cost more, wages go up, and so forth, right? It's not conservative. It's kind of a more open and free and liberated money supply. So the Fed regulated the money supply and also regulated interest rates, which is important. Obviously, if you're going to buy a house, if you have a credit card, although credit card and house interest have very little in common anymore because, credit card debt can be 19%, 29%. Usually, a loan on a house or a car is way lower than that. The Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. loans money to other banks, right, at their rate. And then those banks take that and then they tag on probably a half a point, and then they loan it maybe to other banks. And then those banks loan it to consumers, right? So if interest rates are like zero, that means that loans from the Fed to the major Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, are at 0% for the other banks, right? And then you get it, whatever it is now, 2%, 2.5, I don't know what it is, but it's low, right? And the idea there is to make money available so that people have access to it, so they can buy things, right? They can buy houses, they can buy cars, they can do whatever, right? Credit card debt is very different because credit card debt is huge, right? And it's very, very, very much different, right? So the Fed can invent money. I used to say print money because, you would literally put more money into circulation. You would, with like run the printing presses and make bills, but you don't do that anymore. You kind of click the mouse and all of a sudden trillions of dollars appear on the Fed's like Excel spreadsheet kind of thing. The Fed can do that. They can create inflation. They can make prices higher. They can make wages higher. They can make interest rates higher so that banks can get more money on their loans, right? If money is cheap, then that's not happening now. Let me point out, this is not a good time to use this example because what's happening now is pretty weird. They've been talking about the threat to inflation for a long time. Economists have, so we'll see in the coming years. The point that is important, though, is that with these abilities to create reserve requirements, to set money supply, to set interest rates, the Fed is able to take care of Wall Street banks and drive smaller banks out of business. Now that they're regulated, these smaller banks can't make the kind of loans they used to make, because there was so much competition. They would always try to undercut everybody else. They can't do that anymore because they're being regulated. Now that the money supply is being determined from the Fed in Washington, D.C., they can't just start making loans to everybody who comes in and just like blowing out their entire, their holdings. They can't do that anymore. So many, many small banks go out of business, and quite often big banks, they either go out of business, and sometimes big banks come in and take them over. So it increases the power of Wall Street banks. Now for the consumer, what does that mean? Well, on one hand, it means that those small banks aren't going to be around anymore to exploit you and rob, which is good. But it also means that the interest rates that you pay on loans and the deposit and the interest rate you get on your deposit are different. So you're going to be paying more now if you take a loan out, because it's going to be determined by these conservative practices from the Fed and from Wall Street. And if you deposit money, you're not going to be getting much of a return on it either, because again, it's these conservative practices. So the Federal Reserve Act, which is often seen as the triumph of the people were screwed by bankers and they demanded something be done and government regulated. And yeah, you can look at it that way, but it's also the triumph of Wall Street, because the Federal Reserve Act enabled Wall Street to take control, like total control of the banking industry in America, right? Kind of long-winded, but I think it's important. Now, another area in which that happened, I'll be much shorter on this, and then we'll talk about meatpacking, which is, I think, the easiest one, was insurance. And you're all familiar with the way insurances work, right? You get out insurance on your life insurance, car insurance, house insurance, whatever, right? You pay a monthly premium, then if something happens, they're supposed to take care of it. There was huge cutthroat competition in insurance, just like there had been in banking. There are tons of insurance companies all over the place. Between 1890 and 1905, the number of insurance companies in America doubled, right? Now, some of them are ones that we talked about, like when I talked about the populace, right? You have like State Farm and Allstate, Mutual of Omaha, things like that. But there are small insurance companies all over the place. And in order to survive, you have to do kind of like banking. You have to, compete against other insurance companies. So if, somebody says, I'll give you $5,000 coverage for $10 a month, somebody else is going to say, I'll give you $6,000 coverage for $8 a month, and so on and so forth. But if something goes bad, then they can't pay. They're in trouble, right? If there's a drought, if there's a flood, if something, like when Harvey hit, right? If that happens at the same time, then these insurance companies are out of trouble. They're out of luck. And the people who have insurance policies are the ones really out of luck, right? Because the insurance companies can't make good on them, right? So, these insurance companies are charging too little for premiums, offering more coverage they can afford. So big insurance companies, like the ones that we know about today, that, the Allstates and the State Farms and all those, kind of things, we could have Chris Paul give us a lecture on this probably, demanded that the government do something because these smaller insurers were kind of messing up the whole industry, mucking it up for everybody, right? So again, like the big banks, insurance companies demanded that that smaller insurers have reserve requirements. They had to have a certain amount of money available in case they had to pay out a bunch of people at the same time. And remember, farmers are particularly hard hit. When things go bad, farmers who have insurance often are the ones who lose everything because those rural and agrarian insurance companies, not the big ones like State Farm or Allstate, but the smaller ones are often the first ones to go under. And so, if you have a policy to cover your crops that were flooded out, you're out of luck because the insurance company's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. So again, the government listened to these big insurers and they passed regulations. So again, regulations are often used by big companies, big corporations to get rid of smaller corporations. It's because there's too much competition, right? So in this particular case, insurance regulations were put into effect. Laws were put into effect for insurance, and these smaller insurance companies couldn't do it. They went out of business. Big insurance companies would often come in and take them over. The people who had insurance policies for flood, for life insurance, often were just out of luck. They lost everything, all right? So again, the idea there is to stabilize the particular industry. You wanted to stabilize banking, you wanted to stabilize insurance, you wanted to rationalize it, create harmony, not have all this kind of discord and problem, because it's just not good for business, right? Now, the easiest way to understand this, and I'm spending some time on this because I think it's important, like certain things, these are all in the book, and this is really covered in the book, so it's a stuff you really need to read closely, all right? But I'm also talking about it a little more than some other things because I think it's important just to kind of have this information. Fed, banking, interest rates, that's just important stuff that we kind of deal with all the time, even if we don't recognize that or understand it, right? The most important, I think, reform, or at least the most obvious way to look at this in terms of reform from the top down is meatpacking, because I just told you the story of it, right? Upton Sinclair wrote this story which horrified and disgusted Americans about how disgusting the meat was and it wasn't clean, and so the government did something about it. And that's true, but there's a lot more to the story than that, right? By the end of the 19th century, by the end of the 1800s, there were 4 really big meatpacking companies: Wilson, Armour, Cudahy, and Swift. You've probably heard of them, they're still around. And they controlled the vast majority of the meat industry. And they sold meat not just in the United States, but also in Europe, right? However, there were also a ton of small meat companies all over the place, and they weren't being regulated very much. So a lot of these companies were also trying to sell meat into Europe and other places. They, because they were smaller and didn't have the same kind of money, had to operate differently than the big 4 meat packers did, which means they took risks. So if a meat, might have been a little green, they would sell it anyway. Well, a lot of spoiled meat was getting to Europe. And so the Europeans decided to put a ban on American meat. And they didn't just say, oh, we're going to ban meat from these particular companies. They said from all of them, which means that the big 4, as well as all the smaller competitors, lost the European market. In 1879, Italy banned U.S. pigs because of disease. In 1881, France did that. By the later 1880s, almost all of Europe had banned all American meat from its markets, which is a huge hit, right? So a huge profit loss for these American companies. So the packers themselves, the meat packers in Fort Worth, in Chicago, in Green Bay, in Iowa, all over the Midwest, especially, the big ones said, we're going to do something about this because the Europeans don't trust our meat. It's not clean, it's not safe. So we got to make them, feel comfortable that we're not going to sell them poison meat, right? So the meat packers began to lobby the government. This is years before Upton Sinclair ever went to Chicago to study the meatpacking industry. In 1883, the Department of Agriculture took action to clean up the industry. The first Meat Inspection Act was actually passed in 1891. So the government now stepped in and said, hey, we're going to make sure that the meat that these American packers sell you is clean. It's not going to make you sick. And so Europe began to lift the bans. Now, the Big Four, which controlled 50 to 75% of the entire market, was doing well, but their problem continued to be with the smaller meat packers. The smaller meat packers, even though there were laws in place now, made fewer sales, they had less money, so they were more likely to sell beef or pork that might have been spoiled or something like that, or wasn't as good as the stuff that Swift and Cudahy and Armour and the big meat packers were selling. So there's clearly a difference then between, in terms, so there's a lot of competition. This Big Four controls 50 to 75% of the market. There's a bunch of smaller meat packers who are selling stuff that's borderline at best and sometimes actually spoiled and rotten because they can't afford to throw it away. I mean, if Armour has a bunch of tainted meat, nobody wants to, but it's easy for them to throw it away because they're so big, it's not a big deal, right? It's a small loss, they can handle it. But if a small meat packer has a bunch of tainted meat and they throw it away, they're in trouble because they don't have that kind of size in order to be able to absorb a loss like that, whereas the Big Four can do it easily, right? So the big meat packers demand action against the small meat packers even before the jungle was ever, written, ever conceived, right? Now, when Sinclair wrote that book in 1904, the American public was outraged. They were disgusted, and they demanded something be done. But the big meat packers also saw this as an opportunity for them to go in and demand something be done. So even though, the story of the Upton Sinclair and the Jungle and the Food and Drug Act is that the people demanded something be done and Congress listened to them and passed these inspection acts, that's not untrue. But in fact, the Big Four meat packers went to Congress and put heavy pressure to create Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in order to force these small packers out of business, right? And it worked. It worked because after the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, small meat packers just went out of business in very quickly and in large numbers. So the point of all this is to just kind of talk a little bit about the way reform was done in the progressive era, because I think it's important because I think these things kind of are still kind of in play today. A few years ago, a friend of mine wanted to open up a small neighborhood like beer and wine shop, and she finally just gave up because it was full of regulations. And I know people always say, oh, the red tape and this and that, but the point of it is that these regulations are put in place to harm small businesses like that from getting going, because a lot of them are very, very specific and technical, the size of your window, doors here, doors there, things like that. Big companies like Specs or Total Wines have no problem with those kinds of regulations. They're huge, they have a huge amount of capital, they have a huge amount of money, they have stores all over the place, so they can do that fairly easily. But if you're a small person trying to, open up a beer and wine shop in the neighborhood, it's really hard to do that. It's not by coincidence that Starbucks opens up stores near existing coffee shops. It's much easier for Starbucks with the gazillion franchises it has to meet particular requirements and regulations than it is for a small neighborhood coffee shop, Chico's Coffee, right? So that's important to understand. So when people complain about reform and red tape and regulations, it's important to understand that big businesses are often the reason behind that. Home Depot and Lowe's can meet regulations and requirements way easier. It's much easier than your local hardware shop. There used to be local hardware shops everywhere, and now there just aren't that many of them because Lowe's and Home Depot have driven them out. Not just because prices are better or cheaper or whatever, but also because there are regulations and codes in place that are pretty easy for Home Depot and Lowe's to meet, but much harder and more expensive for small hardware shops or small businesses. And you can apply this to pretty much any particular industry, healthcare, medicine, anything really pretty much exist in that way. So that's the other progressivism, corporate liberalism, conservative reform, whatever you want to call it. And I think it's important. And that's why I've spent a fair amount of time on it, because I think that's still an issue that's ongoing. And when we talk about that, and when you look at the way the economy is structured and how it's very hard for small businesses, especially in 2020, I mean, the number of small businesses that are never going to reopen is going to be huge. But in the best of times, something like 3/4 to 80% of small businesses don't survive 1 year. You just look around Houston and you can see that all the time. And to a large degree, that's because, you know, you just can't compete. You can't meet the same standards and codes that you know, these major corporations, Walmart, right? Much easier for Walmart to do what it does than a small, you know, kind of mom and pop store, which really doesn't exist anymore. All right. So I've also spent more time on this because, you know, in class, this is something that actually we talk about a lot, and the students are kind of into it. We always have good discussions, which I wish we could do here. So I'm kind of talking to myself, I know, but I know that you're listening and you're eager and you're full of questions, and you're going to start asking the TAs all kinds of stuff about this. So, and again, read the book. I can't stress that enough. Read the book. It's vital that you do that, especially in a circumstance like this where we don't have that communication in class like we normally would. So read the book, and there will be questions, not just from the main book, Reconstruction of Rebellion, but from the other books too, about the speeches, about the documents, about the articles. So read that stuff. It's really important. And, you know, you can, you know, if you don't read it, you're harming yourself. You're, you know, I'm not going to say you can't pass, but it would be a lot easier, and your chances of getting a much better grade are much better if you actually do the reading. So make sure you do that. I talk about this all the time in real class, you know, make jokes about it, stuff like that, but I'm very serious, all right? So that's progressivism, and normally I see any questions, blah, 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 and obviously we're not gonna get any of those, so we're gonna move on to the next topic to discuss, which is going to be World War I, right? World War I until World War II was called the Great War. You know, Great War, not a half bad war, not a good war, but a great war, right? So, and they didn't call World War I because World War II hadn't happened yet, right? So until, you know, I'm actually doing this lecture on September 1st, which in 1939 was the official start of World War II. So until like September 1st, 1939, it was World War I. Or I'm sorry, it was the Great War. And then after that, I guess, I don't know, people started calling it, I don't think people started calling it World War I yet. But anyway, I am taping this on the anniversary of the official start of World War II. So if I was in class and we were going to start talking about the Great War, World War I would say, okay, why did World War I begin? What caused it? And a bunch of people would say, oh, because the you know, that Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia, and that would be by far the dominant answer. And of course, you know, I would have fun by saying, well, of course you think that because that's what you all heard, but you know what? That's not really the case, all right? You've probably already noticed, and that's a common theme in here, like that, you know, we get these particular histories that are, you know, very popular, and you might see them on the History Channel, or you might have gotten them in some kind of textbook in grade school or whatever, but quite often they're not, you know, they're not all there, or sometimes they're just wrong, right? And so in discussing the origins of the Great War, we're going to kind of go at it differently. Now, the assassination is clearly an important element in it, and I'm not going to ignore that, right? But to say that started the war ignores everything that occurred before. Wars don't just like occur out of the blue. You don't just wake up and say, you know, in 1914, all these, you know, people in Germany and France and Russia and Britain and everywhere, you know, didn't just wake up and say, hey, let's start a war today. All right, so there's a lot that goes into it. And the Great War actually had its origins, its roots in a global drive for empire. I talked about American imperialism the last time, and that's not just occurring in the United States. In fact, in Europe, among European countries, and also with Japan, it's actually occurring at a much faster rate. They're doing more than the U.S. is with regard to imperialism. All right. Europeans have long had empires and they've long had colonies, whereas the United States really didn't. And even when it did become imperial, it did so based on this idea of, the open door. We're going to send businessmen in, not really create colonies. Well, the Europeans have been doing it the other way for a long time. There were European colonies all over the place. Okay, so this is a map where, the German Empire, the empire of all Russias. The French Republic, but France is an empire. France, for instance, has colonies in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Algeria, Britain. The British Empire is all over the place. It has colonies in Africa. India is a British colony. Egypt is a British colony. The Kingdom of Spain, which, until 1898 still had control over Cuba and the Philippines. Austria-Hungary, which was also known as the Habsburg Empire. And then this one is really important, the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire is important at the outset of the Great War, and it's going to be important again at the end of the semester when we talk about the Middle East, right? Now, all of these empires are trying to gain more power and gain control over more areas, all right? Now, the Ottomans are a particular case because the Ottomans are in bad shape. So we're going to talk about them a little bit more. So you have all of these empires going on at the same time. And it's just like the Americans who take Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico and Guam. So that's going on all over the world. There is a huge drive for empire going on everywhere, right? Now, there is a particular individual who is observing this very closely and writing about it. This is somebody who I'm sure you've come across, right? Vladimir Lenin. He was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? But before that, Lenin was always in trouble, and he had been exiled, right? He got in trouble and was forced out of Russia into Switzerland. And while he was in Switzerland, he wrote a little pamphlet, which is called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, all right? Now, what Lenin did was observe the world. He was looking at the United States. He was aware of the Spanish-American-Filipino War of 1898. He was aware of all this other stuff. And what he saw was a huge race for empire. All of these countries had kind of similar things going on. And all of these countries, they had industrialization, which meant that the people in charge of these countries were like bankers and businessmen and corporations and things like that, who all, like in the United States, needed to keep growing, right? You need to keep growing, 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 growing. Well, at some point, the rest of the world is going to be taken up because all of these empires, the Germans, the British, the French, the Russians, the Japanese, the Americans, are all kind of, taking dibs. They're grabbing whatever they can. Pretty soon there's not much left. So what Lenin said was that there would come a time when the empires themselves would start to fight against each other, right? You go out and you grab up whatever you can. But at some point when everything's kind of taken up, it's like a piñata on the ground, right? Everybody grabs what's available. And then, if you don't get anything, you try to grab it from somebody else who already got, got stuff, candy off the ground, right? So in that sense, the piñata, all the stuff's been cleared up, and now these empires are going to fight against each other. Inter-imperial rivalry, Lenin called it, and that's really important because there is a race for empire occurring in Europe, right? And it's occurring all over. So, and at times it gets violent. In 1899 and 1900, there was a war in South Africa. Now, South Africa was a British colony. However, a large number of people living in South Africa were from the Netherlands. They were Dutch, and they called themselves the Boers, B-O-E-R, all right? And which is a term I should have had up there. Anyway, it's B-O-E-R. And so in 1900, there was the Boer War. Now, this is occurring in South Africa. And South Africa is an apartheid country. It would be until, not that long ago. South Africa is a majority African country, a majority Black African country who, in imperialism, when you colonize people, the people who are there, you don't really care about them. You don't take care of them. You don't really care, right? So the war in South Africa is actually between the British, who control South Africa. It's their colony. And these Dutch settlers, the Boers. So you have these white Europeans in a war for control of South Africa, right? Because you need to have control over as much as available, because there's not that much available anymore. The British ended up maintaining control. The British won the Boer War. At the same time, Britain and France, who were allies, almost fought a war over a place in the Sudan called Fashoda, Fashoda. This is all in the book, by the way. So again, read the book. It's really important, all right? Fashoda was not a place of great economic value. It was near the Northern Nile River, so there might have been some, usefulness in being close to that. Britain thought of creating a railway, but it was not a big deal. Why Fashoda was important was that no one controlled it yet. So like in this competition, it's still free and open. So war did not break out, even though the British and French both had naval forces and troops at Fashoda, which is not a particularly important area. So they're kind of all desperate for more territory, more power. Now, the British, the French, and the Germans were particularly important in this. The U.S. not so much, because we're talking about Europe right now, and Europe is far ahead of the U.S. in terms of imperial development. So the British, the French, and the Germans are all aware that everybody else is trying to get more territory, and they're gearing up and preparing for war. So, the Archduke is assassinated in the car, went out for ice cream or whatever, in 1914. We're talking like the early 1900s here. Lenin wrote this in 1905. So this is way before the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn and then, boom, So between 1905 and 1914, when the war actually began, the British built 42 new warships, and Germany built 29 new warships, because they were both aware that some type of conflict was quite possible, if not like likely, or maybe even inevitable. So everybody is preparing for war. All of these countries, the British, the French, the Russians, the Germans, everybody's building new stuff, especially naval ships, because that's the main form of global war at the time. You're on airplanes, right? And so there's a huge naval arms race. Both all these countries are doing that. They're also making alliances with each other, right? If you're going to go into a fight, then you want people on your side, right? So the French made an alliance with Russia. Now, Russia is not Bolshevik yet, right? Russia is led by the Tsar. So the Russians and the French make an alliance, the Grand Alliance, which says that if the Germans attack either one, then they're going to join the war, right? So if Germany attacks Russia, France will fight, or if Germany attacks France, then Russia will fight. And then the British and the French, who almost came to war over Fashoda a few years earlier, created an alliance called the Entente Cordiale, where they agreed to the same thing. So now you have the British, the French, and the Russians all agreeing that they will help each other out if Germany causes trouble, all right? Now, Germany did the same thing with the Habsburgs, Austria-Hungary, on that map I showed you a minute ago, right? So Austria-Hungary is directly to the south here, the Habsburg Empire, it's called both. So Germany and the Habsburgs have the same kind of arrangement. So you have Russia, France, and Britain on one side, and then you have Germany and Austria-Hungary, or the Habsburgs, on the other side. All of them building up for war, building ships, getting more arms, making ammunition, getting troops ready, right? And making alliances. So it's way before 1914, way before the Archduke was killed. Europe is pretty dangerous already, right? So you have this race for empire, you have these entangling alliances. So everybody is nervous. Everybody's edgy and jumpy. And the place where everything's going to blow up is in the Balkans. All right. Now, just a minute ago, I mentioned the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire are really crucial. The Ottoman Empire was controlled by Turkey. All right. Now, the Balkans is important because it's basically the only area of Europe that isn't controlled by one of those other empires. The Balkans is not controlled, not owned, not colonized by Britain, by France, by Germany, or by Russia, all right? Europe is more important than the rest of, what today we call the third world, because Europe is already more developed. It has industry, it has raw materials, it has resources, it has, coal and iron. You can make coal and iron and steel and, like, I don't know if you can get hockey pucks from Canada, but you can get that other stuff there. And the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, is in really bad shape and ready to fall apart. So everybody is aware that something is likely to blow in the Balkans. The Balkans, if you look at it today, would be Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, well, many of these places that you can see on this map. In fact, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and so on, like between the Adriatic on one side and the Aegean on the other. The Ottomans were controlled, as a big part of that, they were controlled by Turkey. The Balkans prior to this conflict were controlled by the Ottomans too. So this is all mixed in together, right? It's really combustible, right? And so the Balkan states, all of these countries, I'm pointing like you can see it, right? These states here are between 1912 and 1914 fight a war, okay? Now, the particular areas, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, also on and so forth, want independence, but outside groups are also helping them out because they have an interest there too. So for instance, Croatia gets heavy support from Germany. Germany and Croatia have always been allies, so the Germans are supplying weapons and arms and things like that to Croatia, whereas Serbia is getting support from Russia for the same reasons. The same stuff is going on, right? Now, it's within that context then. There was a war. When the war ended, there was kind of a conference where they decided who would get what. And in that peace conference, Serbia believed that it didn't get what it deserved based on how successful it had been on the battlefront, right? The Serbian forces had done quite well, but they didn't get control over these areas that they thought they deserved. And I'm not going to go into detail, and again, read the book. Balkans is ready. It's ready to get lit, right? There's a fuse and it's ready to like burn because everybody is upset about this. Now it's within that context that July of 1914 happens. The Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, was an Austrian, remember the Austro-Hungarian royal family. And there was a Serbian group that was not a government group. Today, I mean, everybody would probably say they're terrorists or whatever, but it was a national liberation group called the Black Hand. And this group went to Sarajevo and assassinated Franz Ferdinand, right? Now, immediately, the Serbian government said, we have nothing to do with this, and offered to pay indemnities. Indemnities are like payoffs, right? Since this guy was killed, we'll pay his family. If you ever watch a mob movie, this is how they do things, right? We'll take care of his family. We'll apologize. We'll do whatever you want. Germany, I know this sounds confusing, but it's not really that much. Germany was putting pressure on Austria-Hungary, the Habsburgs, and saying, don't go make a deal with Serbia. We can use this. So the Habsburgs, Austria-Hungary, refused all of Serbia's offers, apologies, everything. And at that point, everybody in Europe knows that the stuff's about to hit the fan. And so everybody starts mobilizing troops. This is in July of 1914. And so on August 1st, 1914, Germany attacked Russia. And that set off all of those alliances, right? So Russia and France and Britain have alliances. So Germany attacked Russia. And then a few days later, it attacked Belgium in the west, right? So you now have a European-wide war. Here's Russia. Germany attacked Russia. They had been sending troops to the front throughout July of 1914. And then it attacked Belgium right here. And Belgium is allied to the British and the French too. So you now have a European-wide war. So you have, the Russians, the British, and the French against the Germans and the Habsburgs. And this area is kind of up for grabs, and the Ottomans are kind of falling apart. And the Middle East is a big part of this too, which we will talk about when we get to it, right? So all that stuff is happening. There is now a European-wide war beginning in August of 1914 when Germany invaded Russia, and then Belgium, and then England and France joined Russia. All right. So, and again, it's in the book. If this, if you can't get it down, but it's fairly easy. It's Germany and the Habsburgs versus the Russians, the British and the French, and then later, other countries come in. But that's the main thing. The war itself is bloody. We'll talk about that. It's a war of trenches, a war of attrition. Now, since this is a course in U.S. history, what's the U.S. do? Well, the U.S. response is important here. Initially, the U.S. didn't like the war. It was upset because, remember, the United States wants to create an open door. The U.S. wants to be able to go into all of these places, all of these colonies, all of these empires, all over the place. It wants to go to South Africa. It wants to go to Fashoda. It wants to be able to go to China, to everywhere, and sell stuff and buy stuff and invest. It believes in that open door. That's the point, right? Colonies are closed. The door is shut. You can't get in there to do business. But if you have an open door, everybody can get in and do business. So this war is bad for the open door because, boom, everybody's fighting, right? So initially, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, is very upset about this because, wars, at this particular point, probably not good for the American economy. So Wilson initially declared American neutrality. But that neutrality didn't last long. It was very short-lived because Wilson, even though he claimed America was neutral, took sides really from early on, from the start. Wilson always was on the side of the British and the French, the Allies, they were called, right? Wilson, had studied the British system. He had the only president with a PhD, for what that's worth, right? I don't know if Trump University counts, so. Wilson admired the British system. He was supportive of the British system, and it showed. Now, if you look down here, economically, the United States always supported the Allies. So in 1914, the trade, this is U.S. exports, which is vital in war, right? Those countries need stuff, and we'll talk more about that. So in 1914, the Allies, the British and the French, got $754 million worth of American goods, and Germany got less than half of that. But then look at 1915 is the first full year of the war. It's 1.28 billion to only 29 million. And then in 1916, the United States sold $2.75 billion. And what was it the other day? I said, I think the ratio was like 31 to 1. So do the math, right? So 2.75 billion versus 2 million, which is basically nothing, right? So the United States clearly then had an economic interest in making sure that Britain and France did well because they're selling them stuff. In addition to that, wars are costly. The first thing you do when you fight a war, you often is you cash in your securities, right? You go to the bank and you take everything out, right? And when you're out of that, what do? You put on the credit card. Well, that's what the Allies, the British and the French, had to do. So they often went to America. And J.P. Morgan, a famous guy, right? Famous banker, banking house, was the agent for the Allies. So the British and French would go to J.P. Morgan and say, we need money. J.P. Morgan negotiated over $3 billion. And again, do the math. That's a lot of money in 1915 in loans for the British and French. So the British and French are investing heavily, or borrowing heavily, from the United States. Now, if you're selling a lot of goods to these countries, often on credit, and if they're taking loans out from you, do you have an interest in seeing which side wins? Yeah, because you need to get paid. And if the Allies lose, the Germany ain't going to pay you for those goods and for that, right? So these loans are critical because they enabled the British and the French to purchase goods from the U.S. as well. And what did they get? They purchased copper and steel and wheat and oil and ammunitions, right? Weapons. So all of the American loans were essential to making it possible for the British and French to buy the stuff they needed to fight the war. So the U.S. is not neutral, right? Here's a quick thing. That's not to defend Germany. Germany's trying to take control over Europe. So the Germans are hardly good. The Germans and Habsburg aren't good guys in this by any means, right? Now, at the same time that the United States is selling all this stuff to the British and the French, the British had imposed a contraband list against Germany. Now, contraband is stuff that's illegal. And in war, you can create a contraband list, which means you are allowed to prevent countries from getting certain things. Now, what is that usually? It's weapons. So if the British stop a ship headed for Germany that has weapons on it, they are allowed to declare that contraband. However, the British were declaring cotton, medicine, food, and other things contraband. Now, that's a violation of international law. The British were not allowed to do it, but they did. Germany had a starvation winter. They called it the turnip winter because that's when people were forced to eat. People were dying. They could barely survive. They couldn't grow crops in the winter and things like that. The British also were putting American flags on their ships so they could claim to be neutral, so that they weren't subject to the same international laws that British ships would be if Germany stopped it's very different if Germany stops a British ship because they're actually fighting a war against each other, versus Germany stopping an American ship because the United States is technically neutral at the time, right? So Britain has this, what they call a starvation blockade. They're not allowing food or medicine or cotton or things like that in. And so what did Germany do? Germany fought back by unleashing U-boats, submarines. This is the first time subs had been used extensively in war. In 1914, when the war began, Germany had 21 submarines. Now, why is that a big deal? Because according to international law, which used to be a thing, now countries consider it quaint and don't really pay any attention to it. According to international law, if you're in a war and you see another country's navy, you can shoot it. That's fair game. Boom, you shoot it, whatever. If you see a commercial ship, though, you're not allowed to do that. You actually have to search it. You can fire a warning shot across the bow. Now, if they have weapons, then technically you can make everybody get off the ship and then you can sink it and stuff like that, right? But with U-boats, you can't really do that because what would happen? As soon as a submarine surfaces, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to be blown up. So these submarines were attacking Allied shipping and technically neutral ships. They were attacking British ships that had American flags, and they were actually even occasionally would hit an American ship. So the Americans and the British and the French protested submarine warfare. Well, Germany kept saying, look, you're letting the British starve us out, so we have to do this, right? Germany believed submarines were, the only thing it could do, and the Americans, said, no, you can't do that. It violates international law. And the Germans said, well, so does the contraband list. And the Americans said, well, too bad. So Wilson rejected Germany's claims and continued to support Britain and allow Britain to fly neutral flags and have this starvation blockade. Germany, for a time, suspended submarine war because it didn't want to, create a bigger war. But then, it was kind of desperate. So in early 1915, the Germans attacked a ship sailing from New York, the Lusitania. You've probably heard of it. There were over 1,200 people on the Lusitania, including 128 American citizens. They were all killed. Now, before the Lusitania set out from New York, the German government took out ads in the New York newspapers warning the passengers that they believed that ship was carrying arms and could be attacked. Wilson and others said, we refuse to let you, intimidate our citizens that way. We're Americans, we have the right to do that. And so the Lusitania was sunk. Americans were furious. Wilson said, not time for war yet. But he said, Germany, you better stop using subs. And they did, right? They didn't want the Americans coming into the war. So even though subs were their best hope, they continued. They didn't use them for a while. Now, in the meantime, the war itself is not going all that great, right? And this is these are a couple images of subs. That's what they look like. When I see this old subs, it kind of freaks. I can't get in an MRI machine. Those things scare me. So getting in one of those subs would be terrifying, right? That's a trench, which leads to my next point. Subs are very important because most of the war is occurring like this, in trenches. And trench warfare is literally you dig a trench, long, like a tunnel, right? And you lob bombardments, you lob artillery at the other side, and everybody stands up and goes after the other side, and they often get mowed down, and then the other side comes after you and does the same thing. So it's a bloodbath. Neither side is gaining any territory, gaining any ground, and the war is getting really bloody. And just to kind of give you some example of this is a movie that was made in the 1950s, but the people who consulted on it had actually fought in World War I, so it's very realistic. It's a very famous movie by Stanley Kubrick. That's the way the war in Europe is being fought every day. That's occurring every day all over Europe. It's a bloodbath. Neither side is really gaining anything, gaining territory. In one day you're going to have 20, 30,000 people killed. And, and you can see there, that's a very realistic depiction of the way the war was going. Because of that, sub-warfare was really vitally important. The war in the seas was really vitally important. And so Germany, even though it would occasionally suspend it because they didn't want to bring the Americans in, would eventually keep going back and resuming sub-warfare. By early 1917, Germany was desperate. Now, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran for president, ran for re-election. And his campaign motto that year was, he kept us out of the war. Quite often, if there's an international crisis, somebody running for president is going to go and say, oh, no, we're not going to send any Americans to fight the war. Wilson did it in 1916. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt said he wasn't going to fight, send American boys to fight in World War II. And then in 1964, Lyndon Johnson said he wasn't going to fight, send American boys to fight and die when, in Vietnam and stuff like that. So this is what they always do. And in 1916, at the same time, Wilson is saying, oh, he kept us out of the war. I'm not going to war. Sent his main advisor, Colonel Edward House, to Britain, where he met the British foreign advisor, Minister Lord Grey. And they had an agreement where the United States promised Britain that if Germany resumed submarine warfare, the United States would enter the war on Britain's side. So at the same time, Wilson is saying, oh yeah, we're not going into war. He kept us out of the war. He has a deal going with the British to enter the war. Wilson won the election in 1916 on this platform, keeping us out of the war. Then in early 1917, Germany resumed sub-warfare, began using submarines again. And at that point, the United States began to really ratchet up the pressure. Germany was desperate. And so Wilson gave them, his last warnings, and the Germans didn't listen. Now, a lot of people always ask this in class, so that's not going to happen here. But somebody always asks about the Zimmerman telegram. In February of 1917, a telegram from Germany to Mexico was intercepted, and it basically said, "Hey, if you Mexicans start a war against the United States to take them away from Europe, then if we win, we'll make sure that you get Texas back. You'll get all that territory back that they stole from you in 1848, right?" And people think that's a big deal. It kind of not really. The Germans, the Mexicans were not going to start a war against the United States, and didn't have any real incentive or cause to do so. But it is there, it's out there, and you have to deal with it. The reality is that Wilson was kind of dead set on going to war. Germany keeps using submarines, and so on April 1917, Woodrow Wilson walked to Congress and asked for a declaration of war. Wilson said, Germany is attacking us and we have no choice. And so we need to go to war. For what reason? And again, I'd be asking you this, and some of you may be shouting it out at home, right? Spilling your popcorn or whatever. Wilson said he was going to go to war to make the world safe for democracy, right? Now, at this point, we would normally have a long discussion over whether that's true or not, right? So I'm going to have to, again, have this discussion with myself, right? A lot of people said, oh, come on, Wilson believes in the open door, and look at all that trade. The United States is selling all this stuff to the British and the French that they need for the war. They're loaning them all this money, and they're not, they're not allowing Germany to get food and medicine and all that stuff. So, this isn't about democracy. Besides, and we'll talk about this later, look at the way groups in the United States are being treated, like African Americans. So, this isn't a war for democracy, right? But keep in mind, remember the other day when I said, what liberalism was, what capitalism was, this idea of free trade. And that's the way Wilson looks at the world. To people like Wilson and people who do banking, people who do trading, people who are investors, democracy is this idea that you can trade with whoever you want, wherever you want. Business schools often use the phrase commercial liberty. Libertarians use that phrase. Democracy is commercial liberty. Democracy means you can buy stuff, you can sell stuff, you can trade stuff, right? So if you look at it that way, what's Germany doing? Germany is attacking American ships. What are on those ships? Well, sometimes there's supplies on those ships, but sometimes those ships have gone to Europe and they're coming back. Right now, Europe does pay for stuff, right? How do they pay? Do they put on a credit card? No, they give you gold. They give you what's called specie. So sometimes those ships have supplies on them. Sometimes they have gold on them. They're being attacked by German submarines, and they're going to the bottom of the Atlantic, right? So as far as Wilson's concerned, that is an attack on democracy. All that gold at the bottom of the Atlantic, all those ships at the bottom of the Atlantic. So when Wilson said, we're going to make the world safe for democracy, in his mind, that's what democracy was. Free trade, free seas. And if you look at the documents, if you look at all the documents, like in the book of documents we have, Wilson always talks about freedom of the seas, free trade, free ships, things like that. So when Wilson said we're going to make the world safe for democracy, that's what he meant. So he wasn't, in his conception of democracy, he wasn't lying. Democracy, liberalism, capitalism, globalization, internationalism, those are all kind of the same thing. The way these folks who run the country, who are, stand to gain a great deal from this war. People who've traded significant amounts of money already, bankers who've loaned money to the Allies, and Wilson's in the same class as they are. All right. So World War I officially began for the United States in April of 1917. The United States is now a combatant. It's calling itself an associated member with the British and French, right? The U.S. role in World War I is not huge because, it took a while for the United States to actually even get troops ready, had to have a draft. The U.S. didn't have a big standing army. And so the United States' role in the war wasn't, fighting it wasn't great. But we'll talk about that next time. And then what's really important too, I think, is we're going to talk about the war at home, what's happening in the United States while that war is going on, all right? Because Wilson said it was a war for democracy, so we'll see what democracy at home actually looked like, all right? That's class 5. So we are at a good clip. We're getting ahead of ourselves, which is good. It seems like you folks, or a lot of you, are watching these as soon as they come out, so you're staying ahead. I hope you're reading the book at the same time. At the very least, try to keep your reading up to date with these lectures. So today, you should have, I think, the first 2 chapters cover all this stuff, progressivism and World War I. So you should you should keep reading up to this point, in the books, cover everything that covers the stuff through the beginning of World War I, all right? We'll see you next time. I'll have another one of these out, relatively soon. Hope you're enjoying things. If you have any questions, check the syllabus, of course, and then you can always check with the TAs. They're on Blackboard. Blackboard should be up. A couple of people emailed and said that they were having issues, but it looks all of us are able to get at it. So I don't know what the issue is, if there's any problem. But check with the TAs if you're having any issue with anything, really. If you have any questions about what we're talking about in class or anything like that, let us know. Otherwise, continue good luck and be safe. And we'll see you next time from Studio 1378. All right, take care.